30 weeks pregnant, exhausted, and barely sleeping. I thought the worst thing I'd face that week was swollen feet and another sleepless night. I was wrong, because that was the week I discovered my husband wasn't just lying to me. He was sleeping with his secretary. And when I confronted him, hoping for even a shred of guilt, he didn't apologize. He didn't panic. He just looked at my pregnant body, laughed, and said the words that still echo in my head, "You're not attractive anymore." For a second, the room went completely silent. The kind of silence where your heart pounds so loudly you're sure everyone can hear it. He thought I'd cry. He thought I'd beg him to stay. He thought pregnancy had made me weak. Instead, I smiled, and I told him something that wiped the smirk right off his face. That's okay. Because my child deserves a better father than you. What he didn't know in that moment was that I had already seen the messages, the hotel receipts, and the photos he thought he had hidden. And before this story ends, the same man who laughed at me that night will be the one begging for forgiveness, while everyone around him learns exactly what he did. My name is Lena Whitaker, a 33-year-old bookkeeper who spent years finding order in chaotic ledgers and comfort in the predictable balance of a spreadsheet. Before the morning sickness and the heavy aching fatigue of my third trimester took over, I was the woman people in Worthington, Ohio called when their finances didn't make sense. The one who could spot a single misplaced cent from a coffin mile away. I grew up believing that if you followed the rules and kept your books clean, life would reward you with a steady, peaceful home, especially here in this quiet suburb where the lawns are manicured to perfection and the brick houses all whisper stories of stability. 30 weeks pregnant, exhausted, and barely sleeping, I thought the worst thing I'd face that week was swollen feet and another sleepless night. I was wrong, because that was the week I discovered my husband wasn't just lying to me, he was sleeping with his secretary. And when I confronted him, hoping for even a shred of guilt, he didn't apologize. He didn't panic. He just looked at my pregnant body, laughed, and said the words that still echo in my head, "You're not attractive anymore." For a second, the room went completely silent. The kind of silence where your heart pounds so loudly you're sure everyone can hear it. He thought I'd cry. He thought I'd beg him to stay. He thought pregnancy had made me weak. Instead, I smiled, and I told him something that wiped the smirk right off his face. That's okay, because my child deserves a better father than you. The air in our living room felt thick, heavy, with the scent of his expensive cologne. A woody, arrogant fragrance he'd started wearing only a few months ago. I watched him turn his back on me, his shoulders relaxed as if he'd just delivered a mundane weather report instead of a death blow to our marriage. He walked toward the kitchen to pour himself a scotch, the ice clinking against the glass with a rhythm that felt like a mockery. He truly believed he had won. He saw a woman hindered by the physical burden of carrying his child. A woman whose career had been sidelined by sonograms and nursery planning, and he concluded, I was a conquered territory. What Darren failed to remember, or perhaps what he never truly understood, was that my mind had never stopped calculating. I am a bookkeeper. I don't just see numbers, I see patterns. The shift hadn't happened overnight. It began with the little things that a less observant woman might have dismissed as a midlife crisis. He started hitting the gym at 10 o'clock at night, returning with a glow that didn't come from a treadmill. His wardrobe transformed from sensible department store button-downs to tailored Italian shirts that cost more than our monthly grocery bill. And then there was the phone, the black rectangle, that had become an extension of his palm, always face down, always locked, always guarded, like a state secret. The discovery hadn't been a stroke of cinematic luck. It was a lapse in his own arrogance. He had left our shared family iPad on the nightstand while he went down to move the sprinklers on the lawn. It was a humid Tuesday evening in Worthington, the kind where the cicadas hum so loudly they drown out your own thoughts. A notification banner slid across the screen, a bright sliver of betrayal in the darkened room. Tonight was worth the wait, it read. My breath hitched a sharp pain radiating from my ribs where the baby kicked in protest. I didn't hesitate. I used the passcode I'd known for a decade, the one he hadn't bothered to change because he thought I was too tired to be curious. Inside the messaging app, the world I thought I lived in disintegrated. There were photos, selfies taken in dimly lit hotel bars, Camille Rhodes leaning into him with a proprietary grin, her youth draped over him like a trophy. She was 29, his secretary, and apparently the recipient of the regional sales manager charm he used to reserve for me. I scrolled through months of evidence, my fingers trembling, but my eyes remaining clear. I saw the digital trail of a man who was already mentally living in another house. When he finally walked back into the bedroom, smelling of damp grass and fresh air, I didn't scream. I didn't throw the device at his head, though every instinct screamed for me to do so. I simply held the screen up. The light from the iPad cast a ghostly blue hue over his face, stripping away the tan he'd worked so hard to maintain. That was when the laughter happened. That was when he chose to be a monster instead of a husband. He looked at the curve of my stomach, the visible sign of our supposed commitment, and dismissed me as an obsolete model. After he retreated to the guest room, slamming the door with a finality that shook the frames on the hallway walls, I sat down at my desk. I didn't cry. My eyes were dry, burning with a cold analytical fire. I opened the iPad again, but this time I wasn't looking for photos. I was looking for the files he thought were buried in his cloud storage. Among the deleted items and hidden folders, I found a PDF of a residential lease agreement for a luxury apartment in a trendy part of town. The monthly rent was 3 times what we spent on our mortgage. The tenant listed was Camille Rhodes. But there at the bottom of the document, in the bold, practiced cursive I had seen on 1,000 birthday cards and tax returns, was the name of the guarantor, Darren Whitaker. That was when I realized Darren wasn't just cheating. This wasn't a temporary lapse in judgment or a fleeting office romance. He was already building a life without me, piece by piece, dollar by dollar. He was using the equity of our shared history to fund his new beginning. As I looked out the window at the moonlit trees of our quiet street, I felt the baby move again, a slow, rolling stretch. My child would never know the man who had stood in our living room tonight. They would know the mother who refused to be a victim. Darren thought I was a broken woman, but he had forgotten that a bookkeeper always knows how to settle the score. The guest room door, clicking shut, was the loudest sound I had ever heard in our Worthington home, a sharp punctuation mark at the end of a decade-long sentence. I stayed at my desk for a long time, the blue light of the iPad, the only thing illuminating the nursery-to-be across the hall. My body felt heavy, almost leaden, as the baby shifted restlessly beneath my ribs, but my mind was beginning to hum with a clarity I hadn't felt since my first semester of accounting. Darren believed that by insulting my appearance and dismissing my worth, he had rendered me paralyzed. He expected me to spend the night huddled under the covers, grieving the man I thought he was. He didn't realize that he had just handed me the one thing a bookkeeper needs to solve a problem, a reason to look closer at the ledger. The next morning, the house felt like a crime scene draped in suburban normalcy. Darren left early, likely to find solace in Camille's admiration before his sales meetings began, leaving behind only the faint scent of his cologne and a half-empty coffee mug. I didn't waste a second. I sat down at our desktop computer and began the methodical process of digital archaeology. As a bookkeeper, I've always been the one to handle our joint accounts, tax filings, and long-term savings. Darren viewed these tasks as chores, domestic white noise that he was happy to delegate. It was his greatest tactical error. He thought that because he earned the larger salary as a regional sales manager, the money was his to command, forgetting that I was the one who mapped its every move. I started with the credit card statements. For months, I had seen charges for high-end restaurants and boutiques, but Darren had always brushed them off as client entertainment or networking expenses. Now, with the name Camille Rhodes burned into my retina, the patterns emerged like ink in water. I saw the $2,200 leaving our secondary checking account every month for that luxury apartment rental. I saw the $28,000 wire transfer to a local dealership for a sleek white sedan. The car, he told me, was a company-issued perk for a top-performing junior associate. Looking at the dates, I realized he had bought Camille a new car, The same week he told me we should hold off on buying the high-end crib I wanted because we needed to be fiscally responsible before the baby arrived. The sheer scale of his entitlement was breathtaking. Darren wasn't just having an affair. He was undergoing a complete identity transplant. He was a man in the throes of a profound insecurity, terrified that his best years were in the rearview mirror. His sales numbers had been flagging for 2 quarters. I'd seen the dip in his commission checks, and his younger colleagues were snapping at his heels with more energy and lower overhead. Instead of working harder or facing the reality of aging, he had chosen to buy a version of himself that was still young, powerful, and desired. Camille was the mirror he used to see a version of Darren Whitaker that didn't exist anymore. She gave him the wide-eyed adoration of a subordinate, and in return he gave her the life of a trophy wife, using my retirement security as the down payment. In the afternoon, I drove 2 blocks over to see Evelyn Carter. Evelyn had lived in Worthington for 40 years and had retired as a high-level human resources director for a Fortune 500 company. She was the kind of woman who wore pearls to garden and possessed a gaze that could peel paint off a wall. As we sat on her screened-in porch, the sound of wind chimes punctuating our conversation, I showed her the messages I had photographed. I didn't cry. I just laid out the facts. Evelyn sipped her iced tea, her eyes narrowing as she read a message from Camille that said, "Some women lose their husbands the moment they stop trying." The cruelty of it didn't seem to shock Evelyn. She had spent decades watching men in midlife crises burn their lives down for a fleeting sense of relevance. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice a low, steady anchor. She told me that men like Darren only feel powerful until the consequences show up, and that his biggest weakness wasn't his libido, but his vanity. She reminded me that in the corporate world, arrogance often leads to sloppiness. If he was being this brazen with our personal finances, he was likely being just as reckless at the office. She encouraged me to keep digging, not just into the spending, but into the source of the funds. Her words gave me the permission I didn't know I needed to stop being the grieving wife and start being the auditor. I spent the evening in a deep dive, prompted by Evelyn's intuition. I called Marcus Hale, a friend from my university days, who had built a reputation as one of the most formidable divorce attorneys in the state. Marcus didn't sugarcoat the situation. He told me that Ohio is an equitable distribution state, but that financial misconduct, the intentional dissipation of marital assets for an affair, could swing the scales heavily in my favor. He asked me to look for anything that didn't balance. I went back to the spreadsheets comparing Darren's year-to-date earnings with our total deposits. Something was missing. There were large cash withdrawals from his personal account, totaling nearly $68,000 that seemed to vanish into thin air. It wasn't going to the apartment, and it wasn't going to Camille's jewelry or her car. I sat back, my hand resting on the top of my stomach as the baby gave a sharp, insistent kick. The numbers were screaming at me now. Darren was funneling money out of our life with a desperation that suggested a much bigger endgame than a simple apartment lease. He was trying to hollow out our marriage from the inside, leaving me with a shell of a home while he prepared a soft landing elsewhere. But the missing $68,000 wasn't in any local bank, and it wasn't in Camille's name. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized I was no longer just looking at a cheating husband. I was looking at a man who was trying to bankrupt his own family before his child was even born. The discovery of the missing $68,000 acted like a cold splash of water, washing away the last lingering traces of my bridal sentimentality. I realized then that while I had been tracking the emotional wreckage of our marriage, Darren had been conducting a clinical, systematic extraction of our future. My hand stayed on the mouse as I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking like a taunt. I didn't wait for morning. I called Marcus Hale at home, his voice sounding raspy and tired, until I read him the figures. The silence on the other end of the line was the sound of a professional predator catching a scent. He told me to meet him at his office at 8 o'clock the following morning, and to bring every login, every password, and every scrap of paper I had managed to scrape from Darren's digital footprint. The drive into downtown Columbus was a blur of gray highway and rising anxiety. The skyline, usually a symbol of Midwestern stability, felt jagged and foreign as I navigated the heavy morning traffic. Marcus's office was located in a sleek, glass and steel high-rise that overlooked the Scioto River. Inside the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the cozy suburban warmth of my home in Worthington. Everything was sharp corners, polished mahogany, and the quiet hum of high-stakes litigation. Marcus met me in the lobby, his expression grim but focused. He didn't offer platitudes about how sorry he was. He offered a seat at a conference table and a forensic accountant who looked like he hadn't smiled since the late 90s. We spent 4 hours tracing the digital breadcrumbs. Marcus's team was fast slicing through the layers of obfuscation Darren had tried to build. It turned out my husband hadn't been as clever as he thought. He had simply been lucky that no one had looked until now. The forensic accountant finally tapped a pen against a printout of a wire transfer. The money hadn't stayed in Ohio. It had been moved through a series of smaller transactions into a private account at a regional bank in Arizona. My mind raced trying to find a connection to the desert. We had no family in the Southwest, no vacation property, no business interests. Then Marcus pulled up a secondary screen, his eyes narrowing as he read the name of the account's co-owner. It wasn't Camille Rhodes. It was a man named Trent Rhodes. The name felt like a punch to the gut. I didn't recognize it immediately, but the surname was a neon sign. I pulled my laptop toward me and began a frantic search. It took less than 3 minutes to find him on a professional networking site. Trent Rhodes, age 35, was a high-volume real estate agent based in Scottsdale, Arizona. He was also Camille's older brother. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place with a sickening mechanical precision. Darren wasn't just hiding money from me. He was using Camille's family to launder his exit strategy. He had moved nearly $70,000 of our marital assets into an account controlled by his mistress's brother, effectively putting the cash out of reach of a standard Ohio discovery process. But as I looked closer at Trent's social media and professional listings, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Trent wasn't just a residential agent. He specialized in luxury relocation and investment acquisition. On his public page, there was a celebratory post from 2 weeks ago, a photo of a sold sign in front of a sprawling mid-century modern home with a turquoise pool and a view of the mountains. The caption read, "Found the perfect desert oasis for a special client moving from the Midwest. Welcome home, D." The D wasn't a mystery anymore. Darren wasn't just planning to leave me. He was planning to leave the state entirely. I felt a surge of nausea that had nothing to do with my pregnancy. My husband, the man who had sat across from me at dinner for 10 years, was planning to relocate across the country, likely taking Camille with him and leaving me in Ohio with a newborn and a hollowed-out bank account. He was setting up a life where he could be a young bachelor in the sun while I struggled to pay the mortgage in the cold. Marcus watched me as the realization settled into my bones. He told me that this changed the strategy completely. We weren't just looking at an affair or a bit of overspending. This was a premeditated attempt to defraud a spouse and an unborn child. The final blow came when Marcus's assistant brought in a printout of a new real estate listing. It was for our own house in Worthington, the brick home we had spent years decorating, the one with the freshly painted nursery and the flower beds I had planted by hand. It hadn't been officially published on the public market yet, but the coming soon internal listing showed Darren's signature on the authorization to sell. He was preparing to sell the roof over my head without my knowledge, likely intending to forge my signature on the final closing documents or pressure me into a quick sale during the chaos of childbirth. As I walked out of the office and back into the bright Columbus sunlight, the world felt different. The fear that had been my constant companion for the last 48 hours had crystallized into something much harder and much colder. Darren thought I was a bookkeeper who only knew how to add and subtract. He had no idea that I was also an expert at identifying liabilities. He had built his new life on a foundation of stolen money and betrayal, believing that my pregnancy made me a stationary target. but he had made a fatal error in judgment. By involving Camille's brother in trying to sell our home, he hadn't just crossed an emotional line. He had stepped into a legal minefield. I leaned against my car, taking a deep breath of the humid Ohio air, and felt the baby move. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for the only person who mattered, and Darren was about to find out that a woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous auditor in the world. The drive back to Worthington felt like navigating through a dream that had curdled into a nightmare. Every familiar landmark, the local library, the park where we'd attended summer concerts, the small bakery where we'd bought our wedding cake, now felt like a set piece in a play that had already closed. Darren's betrayal was no longer just a series of secret texts or hotel receipts. It was a blueprint. He wasn't just leaving a marriage. He was attempting to erase a decade of shared existence as if it were a clerical error in a ledger. He had calculated my weakness down to the week, betting everything on the assumption that a woman in her 8th month of pregnancy would be too physically depleted and emotionally shattered to mount a defense. He was wrong. As I sat in my parked car in our driveway, staring at the front door of the house, he was secretly trying to sell. The nausea of discovery was replaced by a cold, sharpened resolve. I went inside and headed straight for his home office. Darren was a man who thrived on the appearance of organization, but suffered from the sloppiness of the truly arrogant. I began searching for his digital footprints with the precision of a professional auditor. Within an hour, I found the evidence of his true endgame, an email thread with Camille's brother Trent tucked away in a secondary disposable account. The emails were a clinical map of my displacement. Darren had been planning this for over 6 months. Once the baby's born, I'll move out. One message read, "Lena will be too overwhelmed with the infant to put up a fight. She'll take a small settlement just to keep things quiet and move back in with her parents. We'll close on the Scottsdale property by the end of the month." He spoke about me as if I were a piece of aging equipment to be decommissioned, a variable to be managed. He believed that the exhaustion of new motherhood would be his greatest ally, a smokescreen that would allow him to slip away to Arizona with the bulk of our savings before I even realized the bank accounts were empty. The emotional weight of it hit me hardest the following afternoon during my scheduled prenatal checkup. The OB/GYN clinic in Worthington was a place that usually felt like a sanctuary, a room filled with the promise of new life and the soft hum of heartbeat monitors. But as I sat on the examination table, the paper crinkling beneath me, I felt like an imposter in my own life. The nurse, a kind woman who had seen me through every milestone of this pregnancy, smiled as she prepped the ultrasound machine. "Everything looks perfect, Lena," she said softly. "The baby is growing right on schedule. Will the father be joining us for the next scan? We'll be discussing the birth plan." I stared at the black and white monitor, watching the rhythmic flicker of my child's heart. The silence that followed her question was deafening. I couldn't tell her that the father was currently scouting desert real estate with his mistress. I couldn't tell her that he was counting down the days until this child was born, not out of love, but because it signaled the start of his exit strategy. I simply shook my head, my throat tight. "No," I managed to whisper, "he won't be joining us." In that moment, the last of my tears dried up. The grief that had been weighing down my chest evaporated, replaced by a singular, burning focus. I left the clinic and sat in the parking lot for a long time, watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement. Darren's plan relied entirely on my silence and my perceived fragility. He expected me to be the victim in his story, the sad ex-wife he could mention with a shrug of feigned regret to his new friends in Scottsdale. He had no idea that I had stopped reacting and started planning. He didn't know that Marcus was already drafting a petition that would freeze every asset he thought he had hidden. He didn't know that Evelyn was helping me map out the internal politics of his own company. When I arrived home, Darren was in the kitchen, casually scrolling through his phone while a steak sizzled on the stove. He looked up and gave me a practiced, shallow smile, the one he used for clients he didn't particularly like. "How was the appointment?" he asked, his voice devoid of any real interest. I really looked at him, and realized he wasn't the powerful, sophisticated man he pretended to be. He was a small, frightened person trying to outrun his own shadow. "The baby is fine," I said, my voice as steady as a mountain stream. Everything is exactly where it needs to be." He nodded, satisfied with the brevity of the answer, and went back to his phone, likely messaging Camille about their future kitchen cabinets. He thought he was the architect of this transition, but he had forgotten one of the most basic rules of bookkeeping: you can't hide a deficit forever. The audit was coming, and I was going to make sure that when the final balance was struck, he was the one who ended up in the red. I walked past him to the stairs, feeling the strength in my stride that he hadn't accounted for. I wasn't just a mother-to-be. I was the person who was about to dismantle his entire world brick by stolen brick. The following days were a masterclass in the art of the performance. To Darren, I was the same weary, preoccupied woman he had dismissed weeks ago. I played the part of the nesting mother-to-be with a precision that bordered on the clinical. I folded tiny onesies in the living room while he sat nearby, his thumbs flying across his phone screen as he coordinated with Camille. I let him believe his "you're not attractive anymore" comment had broken my spirit, allowing a calculated layer of dullness to settle over my eyes whenever he looked my way. It was the ultimate camouflage. Because he believed I had already surrendered, he stopped hiding the very things that would eventually destroy him. The true breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon while Darren was at a regional strategy summit in Cincinnati. I was back at my desk, but my focus had shifted from our personal bank accounts to his professional conduct. Evelyn Carter, with her decades of HR experience, had planted a seed of doubt in my mind that had finally sprouted. A man who steals from his wife's future rarely draws the line at his employer's pocketbook, she had told me over a cup of herbal tea. I began a meticulous cross-reference of his corporate credit card statements, which he had foolishly synced to our home office computer for expense reporting. As a bookkeeper, I knew how to read between the lines of a ledger. I saw the patterns Evelyn had predicted. There were charges for the Le Méridien Hotel downtown on Thursday nights, dates that Darren claimed were late-night strategy sessions at the office. There were high-end jewelry purchases listed as client gifts that just happened to coincide with Camille's birthday. Most damning of all were the travel expenses. Darren had been charging the company for weekend trips to Arizona, masking them as market research and distributor site visits. He was using his company's capital to fund his relocation scouting and to entertain his mistress, a blatant violation of corporate policy that bordered on embezzlement. I didn't move immediately. I waited. Marcus had taught me that timing is the difference between a skirmish and a total victory. He was currently preparing the freeze orders for the Arizona accounts, but we needed Darren to feel secure enough to keep talking. That night when he returned from his trip, I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I made his favorite dinner. As we sat in the quiet of our Worthington dining room, the rain drumming against the glass, I watched him. He looked relaxed, almost smug. He was so convinced of his own brilliance that he began to boast a common trait in men who feel they have finally outsmarted the world. "You know, Lena," he said, swirling the red wine in his glass, "it's a shame you stopped caring about yourself. But I've realized something lately. People need to be with someone who actually understands the pressure they're under. Camille. She actually understands me. She sees the vision I have for the future." He said it with a casual cruelty that would have shattered me a month ago. Now it was just another data point. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I simply nodded and reached for my water, my other hand secretly hitting the record button on the phone, nestled in the pocket of my maternity robe. "I'm sure she does, Darren," I replied softly. I led him down the path, asking small, innocuous questions about his vision. He spoke at length about the Scottsdale house, about how he was underappreciated at his current firm, and how he deserved a fresh start. He confessed in his own circuitous way to the funneling of funds framed as taking back what he earned. Every word was a nail in the coffin of his career and his legal standing. He was so intoxicated by his own narrative that he didn't notice the cold, steady gaze of the auditor sitting across from him. By the time he went to bed, I had over 40 minutes of audio. I sent the file to Marcus with a simple subject line: "The trap is set." The next morning I contacted Evelyn. We spent 3 hours drafting an anonymous but heavily documented whistleblower report to his company's ethics and compliance department. We included the hotel receipts, the Arizona flight details, and a summary of the corporate credit card misuse. We didn't send it yet. We were waiting for Marcus to file the divorce petition first. We wanted the legal freeze to hit him at the exact moment his professional world collapsed, leaving him with no resources to fight back. As I watched Darren drive away the next morning, waving a dismissive goodbye from his car, I felt a strange sense of peace. The quiet trap wasn't just about the money or the house. It was about reclaiming the narrative. He thought he was the one walking away, leaving a broken woman behind. He had no idea that he was walking straight into a meticulously planned erasure of his own making. I walked into the nursery, the room he intended to sell out from under us, and sat in the rocking chair. For the first time in weeks, the baby was still, as if sensing that the storm was finally under my control. The auditor had finished her review. The findings were terminal. The following Monday started like any other morning in Worthington, but beneath the surface of our quiet suburb, the fault lines I had spent weeks mapping were finally ready to shift. Darren left the house at 7, complaining about a critical meeting with the board. He looked sharp in his charcoal suit, the one I'd bought him for our anniversary, oblivious to the fact that it was the last time he would ever walk out of that door as a man in control. The moment his car cleared the driveway, I sent a one-word text to Marcus Proceed. By 9 o'clock, the machinery of justice and corporate accountability began to grind Darren Whitaker into dust. Marcus filed the divorce petition in the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas, accompanied by an emergency motion to freeze all marital and non-marital assets. Because of the evidence of financial misconduct and the attempted sale of our home, the judge signed the order immediately. Darren's access to the joint accounts, his personal savings, and the Arizona funds was severed before he even finished his first cup of office coffee. Simultaneously, the whistleblower report Evelyn and I had polished hit the inbox of the chief compliance officer at his firm. We hadn't just sent a vague tip. We had provided a digital map of his fraud. Within the hour, the critical meeting Darren thought he was attending was replaced by an unscripted summons to the Human Resources Department. I sat in our kitchen, my hands wrapped around a mug of decaf tea, picturing the scene. I imagined the confusion on his face when he was asked to hand over his corporate credit card and his company laptop. I imagined the cold sweat that must have broken out when they began asking about market research trips to Scottsdale. The collapse happened faster than even I had anticipated. By noon, Camille Rhodes had already been placed on administrative leave. According to a frantic text Darren accidentally sent to our shared iPad, forgetting in his panic that I could see it, Camille didn't stay loyal for a single hour. Faced with the loss of her career and potential legal charges for her part in the travel fraud, she did exactly what Evelyn predicted. She turned on him. She claimed Darren had pressured her into the affair and used his position of authority to involve her in his financial schemes. She painted herself as the victim of a predatory manager, effectively throwing Darren under the bus to save her own skin. Around 3 in the afternoon, the locks on our front door were changed. Marcus had advised me that given the volatility of the situation, I needed to secure the residence. I spent the rest of the day in a state of hyper-focused calm, moving Darren's remaining clothes into black garbage bags and placing them in the garage. Every shirt I folded felt like a weight being lifted. The man who had laughed at my pregnant body and called me unattractive was currently being escorted out of a glass office building by security. His professional reputation in tatters, and his bank balance sitting at 0. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long orange shadows across the Worthington streets when the heavy thud of a fist hit the front door. I didn't open it. I walked to the window and looked through the blinds. Darren stood on the porch, his suit jacket wrinkled, his tie pulled loose. He looked smaller than I remembered. The arrogance that usually radiated from him had been replaced by a raw, jagged desperation. He knocked again, less forceful, this time his head bowed. "Lena," he called out, his voice cracking. "Lena, open the door. Something's happened. There's been a mistake at work and my cards. My cards aren't working. We need to talk." I picked up the phone and dialed the intercom. "There's no mistake, Darren," I said, my voice echoing through the speaker on the porch. "I've seen the Arizona accounts. I've seen the lease for Camille's apartment. And I'm sure the HR department enjoyed the receipts I sent them this morning. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched through the slats as he stepped back, his face pale in the porch light. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked genuinely afraid. He realized then that I hadn't been a passive observer of my own life. I hadn't been the weak, pregnant woman he could discard. I was the auditor who had been watching his every move, waiting for the moment the numbers no longer added up. "You can't do this," he stammered, looking around at the quiet neighborhood as if someone might come to his rescue. "I have nowhere to go. Camille." "That sounds like a personal problem, Darren," I replied. "Your bags are in the garage. I suggest you take them before I call the police to report a trespasser. Oh, and one more thing. Don't bother calling Camille's brother. Marcus has already served him with a subpoena." I turned off the intercom and walked away from the door, leaving him standing in the dark. As I climbed the stairs to the nursery, I felt a sharp, familiar kick. It was as if the baby was acknowledging the shift in the atmosphere. The house was finally quiet. The man who had mocked me was now the one with nowhere to turn, and for the first time in months, I slept through the entire night. The final weeks of my pregnancy were marked by a silence that was no longer lonely, but deeply earned. In Worthington, the seasons were shifting, the humid Ohio summer giving way to a crisp, golden September. I spent my days finalizing the nursery, painting the walls, a soft, warm cream that caught the morning light. Darren was a ghost, a name on legal documents that Marcus shuttled back and forth with a grim sense of triumph. Without his salary, his corporate status, or his access to our joint funds, Darren had been forced to move into a cramped studio apartment near the airport. Camille had vanished from his life entirely, her unwavering support evaporating the second his bank balance hit zero. The final settlement meeting took place in a sterile conference room 3 days before my due date. Darren looked like a shadow of the man who had stood in my living room and laughed at me. He sat across the table, his eyes bloodshot, clutching a cheap paper coffee cup. He had lost his job, his reputation, and his leverage. His lawyer, a man who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, pushed a stack of papers toward us. Darren's main argument, the one he'd been clinging to like a life raft, was that he was entitled to half the equity in our home. He believed that the house was our biggest marital asset, a prize that would fund his fresh start. I watched him as Marcus laid out the final blow. "There's one detail you've overlooked," Darren Marcus said, his voice smooth and cold. "The down payment for the Worthington property was made using Lena's inheritance from her grandmother. Under Ohio law, that remains separate property. And because Lena was the one who managed the books, we have every single canceled check and bank statement showing that those funds were never commingled with your income." The color drained from Darren's face. He turned to his lawyer, who merely gave a curt, defeated nod. I leaned forward, the weight of my child heavy and solid, a reminder of what was truly at stake. "You said I wasn't attractive anymore," I said, my voice quiet but filling the room. "But apparently I was valuable enough to build your whole life on. You spent years living in a house you didn't own, spending money you didn't earn, and planning a future you didn't deserve." He tried to speak, but no words came out. He was realizing in real time that his exit strategy had been built on sand. He had gambled his family, his career, and his home on the assumption that I was a variable he could discard. Now he was leaving with nothing but the garbage bags of clothes I'd left in the garage, and a court order to pay child support from whatever meager income he could scrape together from his new entry-level sales job. 2 days later, my daughter was born. Evelyn Carter was the one who drove me to the hospital, her steady hand on the wheel as we navigated the familiar streets. When I finally held my daughter in my arms, looking out the hospital window at the sprawling Ohio landscape, the world felt balanced. The ledgers were closed. The audit was complete. A week later, Evelyn stopped by the house with a tray of lasagna. We sat on the back deck, the air smelling of fallen leaves and wood smoke. "You did well, Lena," she said, looking at the sleeping infant in the bassinet. "Some men lose everything because they think they deserve everything. They forget that the person keeping the books is the one who ultimately decides when the account is overdrawn." I looked at my home, the brick walls, the garden I had tended, the nursery where my daughter would grow up. Darren had reached out once, a desperate, rambling email asking for a second chance, claiming he had made a mistake and was lost. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I simply hit delete and went back to my life. The man who had laughed at me when I was at my most vulnerable was now a cautionary tale in a town that valued substance over sizzle. As the sun set over Worthington, I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't the money I'd saved or the house I'd kept. It was the peace of knowing that I had protected my child from a man who never understood the value of what he had. The books were balanced, the debt was paid, and for the first time in my life, I was looking forward to a future that was entirely my own. The story of Lena Whitaker is more than just a tale of suburban drama. It represents the silent strength of every woman who has been underestimated while building the very foundation her family stands upon. Watching Lena transform from a woman blindsided by betrayal into a calculated architect of her own justice reminds us that vulnerability in pregnancy is not a weakness, but a period of profound transition that deserves the utmost respect. The most striking lesson here is that arrogance is a blindfold. Darren lost everything not just because he was unfaithful, but because he believed his partner was incapable of fighting back. As a creator, I believe this story serves as a vital wake-up call to never mistake someone's silence for, or their patience for, ignorance. My advice to anyone facing a similar crossroads is to lean into your professional strengths. Whether you are a bookkeeper like Lena, or a teacher, an artist, or a manager, because those skills are your greatest weapons when your personal world becomes chaotic. You should always maintain a clear trail of your own assets and never delegate your financial security entirely to someone else, regardless of how much you trust them. Do not let someone else's narrow definition of your beauty or your worth become your reality. And most importantly, never feel guilty for protecting your peace and your children from someone who treats you as an expendable variable. Lena's victory proves that when the ledger of life finally balances, integrity and intelligence will always outweigh deceit and vanity. Would you like me to help you draft a specific script for your video intro to match this powerful ending?